Hi guys, welcome back to my channel where the gnomes live. This is Sharon Oyella, and today I'm going to show you how I made all of these miniature baskets, and I made them using pine needles that had fallen to the ground. And I was totally inspired after watching Wild She Goes here on YouTube, and she makes life-size baskets, and she uses longer needles than I have available in my area. So that tripped me up a little bit, but I made it work, and I was able to make all these little ones here. So I filmed this video over a course of about a week and a half, 2 weeks I'd say, as I was still learning myself. Along the way I figured out how to do the handles, how to add a little raised edge here. I've also included how I did the wire handles for this picnic basket and a hinged lid. And I put timestamps in the pinned comment below. It's very detailed and it's a long list, so you can move around the video as freely as you wish. And of course, a big shout out to Wild She Goes for her inspirational and very knowledgeable video on how to use pine needles to make baskets. I am forever grateful to her for what she's shown me. And I'm really excited to pass this along to you guys today. So with all that said, let's get started. So before we get started, let's go over the supplies list, and the most important thing, of course, is the pine needles. And depending on where you live, the pine needle length will vary. These are between 4 and 6 inches long, and they work great for miniatures. For making larger baskets, apparently you need longer needles. However, I did use these to make my bigger basket, and it worked just fine. I didn't have any problems. A little bit of a challenge, but really no problems. And the other thing you're going to need is a gauge. Now, the gauge is a small tube that you'll stick your needles into, and I don't know what the main sort of gauge people use for making regular baskets, but for me, with the miniatures, I found out that 6 needles work great. I used a piece of oxygen tube. I found this in a thrift store. It's also the same size as fish tank tubing. And you want the gauge to be full always as you're working, and you want to be able to slide the gauge up and down. So I found that around that 6 or 7 needles work great. And to show you the difference in the gauge sizes, this is a disposable straw, a little section of a disposable straw. This is it here. You can see I've cut it down a number of times. It's actually a regular drinking straw. And you can see all the needles that I can fit in there. And that's what I use to make this bigger basket. So to use this little tubing here, oxygen tube or fish tank tubing, it holds only 6 or 7 needles in it, and that worked out perfectly for these little tiny baskets. So that's how I came up with that number. Alright, so to get yourself a smaller gauge like this one, what we're going to do is we're going to take this section of a regular straw and we're just going to cut down the middle. Then we're going to get our needles, 6 or 7 of them. And please don't get hung up that number. It'll all depend on what you feel comfortable working with. I'll stick them inside the straw, and then I'll roll the straw up around them. So I'll push that one section in and roll over top, reducing that size of that straw quite a bit. And once I get it down to where I can slide the straw, but I have a little bit of resistance, now I'm going to take some masking tape and I'm going to hold that in place. And this is a good solution for those of you who can't find any tubing, because I'd hate to see you guys go out and buy anything. If you can actually use just a regular old drinking straw, just have to cut it down, that's all. Alright, so the next thing we're going to need is some thread and a needle. Now the thread you're supposed to use is a stronger thread, one that won't break. A wax thread is great. This is what I had on hand. I believe this is just embroidery thread. This did break on me a number of times as I was making my projects, but I kept using it. It worked out fine. And the needle, whatever size you're comfortable working with. I wanted a longer needle. I don't know what the size that is. It's just whatever I had on hand. Now the reason why I chose brown thread is because pine needle baskets are done with a special sort of stitching, like a fancy stitching, and that's part of the art of them. But because I was just starting out and I was making such small little projects, this is what it started looking like for me. And I could see very quickly it was going to start looking very messy. I couldn't go slow enough and get those split stitches in there. And I'll let you watch other people's videos on how to do that. For the sake of going a little bit quicker, I chose brown thread so I didn't have to worry about the stitches. And this was totally unplanned when I started this video, but I ended up turning one of my baskets into a picnic basket. So I'm going to show you how I did these handles here that move, how I hinged the lid, and what I did to line the inside. So for all of that you'll need some wire, and I use florist wire from the dollar store. If you don't have any of this on hand, this is just basic wire that's been wrapped, and I'll talk more about that when I get to that part of the video. And I use some string or a little piece of yarn, some tacky glue, some paint, and then a piece of fabric for the inside. This is very thin, see, you can see right through it there. You want to find thin fabric like a handkerchief, and some thread, of course, scissors. I also used an awl, and I think that's about it. Alright my friends, I am popping in with an edit to be super clear that these are needles that fell off the tree already and they have been laying on the ground for quite some time. There's reasons why you don't want to work with the green needles and I'll let you Google the reasons why. And because they laid on the ground for some time, they do have mildew spots. There's black spots on them. From what I've read online, that's totally fine. You can still work with them as is. If you wanted to get rid of those black spots, you'd have to bleach them. Now, I personally don't want to use bleach in my work, but because we're working with miniature, I don't see the issue. I'm looking at my finished projects here and they're not standing out to me, the black spots. I just see an adorable little basket. I'll let you decide what you want to do with yours, and maybe yours are fine. Maybe it's just mine. But yeah, I'll let you Google more information on that. So yeah, let's just dive into the next clip. I'm going to get these started by washing them in some hot soapy water. Get all that dirt off of there. And the next step is bring a pot of water to a boil, and I'm going to take it over to my island over here. So I'll just pop them in there, and I'm going to pop the lid on, and I'm going to leave them sit like that for about 30 minutes. My timer just went off, so these are ready to go. I'm just going to drain out the water. Alright, I'm going to pop them on my wet cloth over here, and this is where I'm going to keep them as I'm working. If I wanted to leave the project for any amount of time, or even overnight or a couple of days, what I'd do is just cover them up with this cloth. I'd want to make sure that the cloth is damp, and stick them in the fridge until you're ready to start working with them again. And the reason why we want wet needles is so that they don't break as we're bending and sewing them. In the video that I watched, she would pull these little knobby things off as she was working. And I don't know if that's done for a purpose or not, but again, we're making miniatures, and to make my life go a little bit easier, or things to go a little bit faster, I just cut them off. So let's get started, guys. We're going to start making a basket. Alright my friends, we're about to get started, and I'm just going to remind you real quick that this is a new craft to me. So all of these baskets here are my very first baskets. This one right here is my very last basket. So all of those ones I've made over the last week, and I've never made any baskets before that. So when I watched that video where I got inspired to make baskets, when she started her first rounds, she would wrap the pine needles with thread and then sew those together and then continue on. And when I tried that with miniatures, I had a really hard time. I got frustrated and I gave up. And then I decided, no, I don't want to give up. I want to still make my baskets. So I did my first couple of rounds without wrapping, and I found that worked for me. And so I went on to make this basket and all of these here, and this one as well. This one, the first couple of rounds were not wrapped either. And then yesterday, after I finished filming most of this, I decided to give it a try again, and it worked. But I did do a couple things differently. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you how to do the first two rounds by wrapping the thread first, and then we're going to go into the next clip and I'm going to show you how to start it without wrapping. So then you can decide which way works better for you, and then you can continue on making your baskets however you want. I would suggest learning how to do it by wrapping the needles first, because it does give a stronger start. So that's going to be method one. We're going to wrap the needles. So choose the longest needles you have. I think when I first started I didn't do that, and that's part of the reason why it tripped me up. Mine are about 6 inches down to about 5 inches. And my gauge holds about 6 needles. I'm going to use 7 or 8 to get started with, just to get a good strong base. I'm going to take my thread. I got all the cut ends of my pine needles on one end, and I'm going to tie off this one end. And this is a little bit different from the way I saw in that video where I learned how to do this. I kind of played around with it last night and realized, oh, I can do it, but I had to change just a couple of things. Not change, tweak a couple of things. This is not my idea at all. Okay, I'm going to tie that off, getting close to the end there. Okay, and then my short tail, I'm going to hold it with my needles, and I'm just going to wrap, and I'm going to wrap and wrap and wrap until I have 2 inches of thread. So I wrap and stop, push those down to where I tied them off, and then continue wrapping. It's funny when you first start a craft and you think something is too difficult to do, you just kind of give up on it. And that's what I did, but I went on to make all those baskets without doing this first, and then try it again, and oh, it's actually quite simple. But I think it's nice to have options, right? Have different ways of doing things in case you do get frustrated with the thread. And that's about 2 inches right there. You can even go a little bit further than that if you wanted to. But I think that's good. Okay, now I'm going to cut my thread. I'm going to cut down about 24 inches. And I'm going to thread this other end with my needle. And I'm just going to cut the exposed pine needles there. Leave a little bit so your threads don't come off. And now take this end, I'm going to make a spiral. Okay, and then another one, and then another one. Kind of looks like a snail. Hold that, and now bring your needle through. If you can get through all of them, that's great. And then pull snug. Don't pull too tight because it could break your thread. And I'm going to sew through a couple of times to hold that spiral. I'll push the back of the needle on my table and pull it through. Again, not too tight. Now instead of going through, I'll just wrap around and do some stitches that way. Wrapping over, coming through. Wrapping over and coming through. So we're sewing those 2 rows together. Going. And there we go. So now we can put our gauge on and then just keep twirling this around and sewing those rows together. And I'm going to show you what the next steps are after I show you how to start the round without wrapping your thread. So in the next clip, we're going to learn how to do this one here. And then we'll continue on making our basket. I'm going to thread my needle with about 3 feet of thread, and I'm not going to knot the ends or anything. Depending on what kind of thread you're working with, if you have very tangly thread, then you might want to work in shorter strands. Alright, so I'm going to take about 6 or 7 needles there and just see if they fit into my gauge. And they do, and I can slide my needles, and I have a little bit of resistance. I'm going to take the gauge off. Okay, so I'm going to take the cut ends and hold the rest of the pine needles like that between my thumbs. I'm just going to bend them, and don't worry if anything breaks or anything. You can keep going. If you feel like you can't, you can take those pine needles off and replace them. Even if I did have a few cracked ones, I kept them in there and then just sewed them together and they held together fine. Okay, so I bent them down once, and I'm going to take those ends, those cut ends, I'm going to place them over top my pine needles. Kind of eliminate that gap in the center. And then I'm going to just turn them one more time, spinning them. Oh, that was 1.5 times, I guess. And now I'm going to take these ends here. I don't have to do this, but they're kind of in my way, so I'm just going to cut them off. And even if there's a little bit of a gap, I'm not going to worry. I'm just going to put those ends, kind of spread them out there. Try to eliminate that gap in the center. Before I continue wrapping, I'm just going to hold it with my thumb and just get a couple of stitches in there. I'm going to pull the thread through. And remember, I didn't knot the ends, so I'm just going to leave it with a little bit of a tail hanging out the other end. I'm just going to grab that with my fingers. I'm going to wrap around and sew through. You can go this way or around that way, it doesn't matter. Just want to get a couple stitches in there, kind of hold everything together. There's one, I'm going to wrap over, sew through. I'm going to wrap under and sew through. I'll wrap under and sew through. Okay, now that thread's not going to pull through, so I can cut that tail off, that starting tail. I'm going to cut that off. Okay, so now I got a couple of stitches in there and it's holding everything together. I'm going to get my gauge back on there, and now I can use my gauge and just pull my starting bit there and pull my needles down and around. And I'm going to wrap over and sew. And this is where I really appreciate the brown thread. No one's going to see my messy stitches. Well, I guess you can really see if you look up close, but I think the end results are pretty adorable. So now I'm going to turn it one more time. Wrapping over and sewing through. Wrapping over and sewing through. Okay, and now my gauge is starting to slip, so I'm going to stick some needles in there. So if you're making a larger basket, when you put your needles in, you go in the center to kind of hide them, but we can't do that with these limited number of needles. So I'm just going to put it right here. If it gets stuck, pull the gauge out a little bit and then push it. You see the other end there? And I'm going to push it right down in between where the needles are just coming out my last thread piece there. So in between the base and the stack of needles. And now when I roll this down, that new needle is just going to be hidden in between that roll. So over, and the starting rounds are a little bit more finicky, right, until we get something larger to hang on to, but we kind of sign up for that when we're doing miniatures. Miniatures are always finicky anyway. Okay, and again my gauge getting a little bit stuck, so I'll just pull it out and then push that needle down. Now look, see how it's coming out here? And I've never had that happen before, but I can already feel if I hang on to the center, I can pull this side, pull it, and pull those into shape. Look at that, like magic. And to be completely honest, I don't follow a scale in my miniatures at all. Everything is done by eye. I make everything for the creatures that I've created myself. These guys are all 3 to 4 inches tall, and I do everything by eye. So I'm sure this would be good for a 1/12 scale, but it would also be good for these guys here. It's a bassinet, right? So, and all I did was just eye up. Just took a look and thought, yeah, that'd be the right size for them. So that's pretty much how I work with my miniatures. I know that's frustrating for some people because they like to have everything measured. So I will give you measurements of the base and the top, the finished product and all that later on in the video, but as a rule, I don't follow any rules. So right from here, I could make a small basket, and all I have to do is just start sewing the pieces on top of each other. So instead of going around, I would take the stack and I'd put it right on the sides. And if I want the basket sides to go straight up and down, then I would make the needles stack straight up and down. If I wanted to flare out a little bit, I'd hold them away from the base just a little bit as I sew. It's hard to show because they're so little, but you'll definitely get the feel of it as you go. This one here, I'll just do straight up and down for you so you can see what that looks like. So you're going to continue going around, but this time sewing them on top of the base. I just hold them in place there. So I've made it around once. I'm going to go again. I'm just going to pick up the needles and stick them on top of the last row. And then I'm going to, when I wrap around, I'll just sew to the row underneath it. Okay, so my thread is getting short, so I don't want to keep sewing with that one. So I'm going to sew around one more time. And before pulling it all the way, I'm going to go through that loop. And then pull tight. I'm going to bring the needle down into the base, and then I'm going to go a couple times in and out of the base in short little stitches. And then that thread will never let go once you get through a couple of times. I'm going to bring it down one more time, and then I'm going to cut it free. And again, I'm not knotting any ends. I'm just going to bring it through the bottom anywhere. Just bring it through. Pull it almost all the way through, leave a little tail, and then go in and out in short little stitches back to where you left off. And by the time you get to the other side, the thread won't be going anywhere. It's stuck in there. And now I'll cut that starting thread free. I'll add a couple more needles. And when you're sewing on the sides, it's kind of, that needle can't be really hidden into the roll, so I just kind of stick it down as far as I can, get it to the base, and just kind of hold it in place while I sew around it. And if your thread breaks along the way, it's happened to me many times as I was making these baskets. It's no big deal. I would just not worry about it, just start a new strand and just sew over the last stitch that you made, like sew over it twice, and then continue on, and it'll hold. All mine held. Oh, I think that completed the second row. So now I'm going to continue on for the third row. Okay, starting the third row, I will sew it to the second row. Anyway, I finished the third row, so I'll just sew the fourth row to the third row. So I just finished the fourth row, and for the fifth one, I think what I'll do is flare it out at the top like I did this one. They're shaped a little bit differently. That one has a lip on the outside, and that's just by holding the stack a little ways on the outside and then sewing it in. And if I wanted to have it tapered inward, I would hold it inside and then sew it in. Okay, I'm coming to the end of the fifth row, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to cut this on an angle. I don't want to cut it straight because it'll give too much bulk in the area that I tuck them in. And I'm just going to place them inside the basket and sew them in. Sorry guys, it's such a small little basket, it's hard to do this without my fingers getting in the way. And when I do my next basket for you, the bassinet, I'll show you how to end it again. It'll be a little bit more clear with that one. Okay, and I'll finish off, and I'll bring my thread down, in and out, and then cut it free. And while it's wet, you can help put things back into shape if they're a little bit wonky. They're all going to be wonky when they're finished anyway because they're baskets, and most baskets are. They're not. So I'm going to give you the measurements, and like I said, I don't follow any rules or anything. I just eye things up, and they kind of take their own free form unless I'm purposely doing a shape like this one here. So all of these, I kind of just did a circle and then stacked the sides. Didn't really think about the end shape. I just kind of went with the flow. The circular one is 1 inch around, so it's pretty much a circle. The one we just did has a little bit more of an oval shape to it, and it's 1 inch by a little bit better than 1/2 inch. And the height of them is, this one's 1/2 inch. So my bread basket is 1 inch by right on 1/2 inch. And then you can see the sides, I flared them out quite a bit as I got to the top to give me that cool shape. And when I started it, of course it wasn't started in a circle, I did more of a rectangular shape. Okay, so you can have fun with those shapes and sizes. So next we're going to do the bassinet, and I'm going to start the beginning rows the same way I started the one we just did. So the next clip, I'm already finished the base, and we're going to start stacking the sides. But I'll give you the measurements in the next clip. So let's get started. So I think I'm happy with that size right there. So that's about 1 3/4 and 1.5 inches. I'm going to kind of hold it out on the side just a little ways because I want it to flare out like this one. And that's pretty much what I did with this one. So the stack is still sitting on the base, but it's kind of pushed over. So I'm going to turn the camera off, and once I get around to the other side, I'll come back and show you what it looks like. So I've made it all the way around my first row that's been stacked. And so the second pass over is the same thing. You just pull the coil on top of the first one. And I'm holding it out a little ways. I don't want to keep doing that for every row, of course, otherwise it's going to flare right out. But you'll get the hang of it as you go along. And remember, I'm just starting to, I'm learning as I go here. I don't know how many rows I'm going to do. This is my second row. I'll try to count them as I go along, but I won't make any promises. Anyway, when I turn the camera back on, I should be at my last row, and then we'll figure out from there what we're going to do. So I think I'll stop right here. That looks like the perfect, adorable little size for a bassinet. This is 7 times around, right about there. And now I'm going to sew this down. I'll stick it inside the bassinet just a little ways. So this is actually the next day, guys. I finished last night, couldn't see anymore, so I decided to work on it this morning. So what I did was I stuck the protruding part of the basket underneath my cloth here and stuck it all in the fridge. And right now, these pieces here are very pliable, so that method works well. Okay, I'm going to pass through that loop before I pull it tight. And we are done. Again, I'll just work this down to the bottom. I'm just going to do a simple little raised part here. And this is going to be my very first time trying this, so bear with me. Just started a new string of thread there. And I've chosen the longest needles that I have because I want to make sure that I can get from point A to point B in one go. I'll place the end of these needles just past the halfway mark, and I'll sew those in. Okay, I got my ends sewn in, and now I'm going to place this right on the top edge, kind of stacking them all on top of each other. And now I'll sew that in, and then I'll wrap over and right underneath. I'll bring the thread over just a little ways, wrap over, and sew that in. Okay, I've made it around, and I'm going to trim these up to the same length that I had over here, right about there. And I'll just stick those right inside the basket, and I'll sew those ends down. So I'm going to repeat that same step over again with 6 more needles. This time I'm going to turn the needles around so I have the tapered end where I started the last time, just to reduce the bulk. Okay, so I got them stacked on top of each other. Now I'm going to go ahead and sew that in best I can. Alright guys, I'm going to be totally honest with you, and that was actually pretty difficult and finicky. I'm going to strengthen it with glue in a bit here. I'm just going to tie down these ends now. And so I'm thinking that if you're wanting to make something with a little bit more of a raised edge here, I would work with some toothpicks. I would sew some toothpicks in. I'm just thinking about baskets that, that I've seen in real life, and you'll see that they have sticks sewn inside for stability, and then they weave around that. So there's an idea for you. This was just really difficult to keep them stacked on top of each other, but I'm happy I got to the other side. Okay, so for the handles, I took 3 needles, and I'm just going to twist them. And I tried to do this different ways, but nothing was working out, so you can twist them again once they're sewn in. And on my first set there, I did tie off the first ends. I didn't do it this time around, but you can do that as well, make it easier. So those are just simple whip stitches around the bottom of the handles, and I would recommend putting in tacky glue in and around the bottom of the handles when you're all done, because they could pull through if you don't do it that way. So I did add my glue, and you can see I'm pulling on that and they're not budging. So I did add the glue, like I said, for the back here as well, and that was really flimsy when I put it on there, and now it's pretty strong, but I made a mistake. I didn't mix my glue with water, and you can see it's left a little bit of a glue film. And actually I did add glue to a couple of these baskets here, just on the interiors, not the exteriors, because I wasn't sure if pine needles would shrink when they dry or how those stitches would hold up. So I did do a layer, and you can see there's no film in there. And that's because I dipped my paintbrush in the water, and then just a little bit of glue. Get the paintbrush saturated with water first. and then the glue, and then I would just paint where you want to strengthen up the area. So I'm going to put it on here so you can see once it's dry there won't be a film there, but it will be strong. So I put glue on top of my handles as well, just to keep them from separating ever, the twist, and then in and around where they were stitched down, so in between the handle and the basket, and paint wherever you want the glue. Okay, and then just let that dry. So we did pine needle handles, and now I'm going to show you how to do these wire handles in the next clip. So let's get started. So this was completely unplanned. I've decided to make this into a little picnic basket. I was just playing around with a bit of wire here. Now these are florist wires from the dollar store. So they're just basically plain wire that have been wrapped. So if you don't have access to the same thing, it doesn't matter. You can just use plain wire, or you can wrap wire with masking tape and then just put a little bit of tissue paper on it with glue and leave it dry, and then you'll have a surface pretty much similar to this here. And I didn't measure this. I should have cut two at the same time. Okay, so I'm just going to bend this tip in. And then I'm going to strip off the paper part. And just expose that wire under there. So I'm going to get this exact, so I'm going to poke my holes right now. I'm going to poke a hole right here with my awl. We wanted to squeeze a little bit, and this is where that stiff wire comes in handy because it will hold its shape. Now I'm going to pull it out, and because this wire does hold its shape, I'm going to trim off a little bit of that wire here and here. This way there's not so much of that wire sticking inside the basket. Now earlier I did try to bend it inside there, but I felt like I was at risk of breaking the basket, so I thought it was better just to trim it up. Okay, to make this little bit of decoration on there, and now this is completely optional, this is just something I wanted to do. I'm going to take some string, I'm going to double it over, and I'm going to dip it in tacky glue. Well, I'm going to dip my finger in tacky glue, and I'm going to rub it all over the string and twist the string at the same time. And I'm going to wrap it around this wire, but I'm going to start on the outside, not the inside, because I don't want the string to interfere with this turning or spinning like that. Okay, so I'm going to put it on the outside, start it on the outside, and now just twirl it around. And again, when I come down here, I don't want it on the inside, I'm going to put it on the outside. Oh, and this is a good time as well to put glue around that wire where we trimmed off the paper covering to keep it from unraveling in the future. Pulling tight and around. That's dry now, so I'm just going to coat it all in black, and then I'll do a little bit of brown and a little bit of beige for some highlights. And then I'll let that dry, and then we'll come on back and see what we got. And once the paint is dry, of course you can just pop those back on there, and I'm pretty happy with how those turned out. And I did make a lid after all, and I'm going to show you how I made the lid after I show you how I added in the twine handle. So you have a couple of options for handles. So let's get busy on that, and then we'll start making some lids. First of all, I'm going to get a length of twine. Just going to knot the one end and carry that knot right to the end and pull tight. You can add a bit of tacky glue to the end so it never comes loose after we're all done here. Okay, I'm going to take my awl and make sure I'm doing it even on both sides. Just a little bit under the rim, poke a hole, and work at it. Now that I have a hole there, I'm going to take a bigger needle and just go through it again and work at it. Earlier I didn't use a needle to pull this twine through, I actually pushed it through, and I can show you how that's done after I do this one here. Okay, and then pull it to the knot. Okay, so if you don't have a needle, all I did was just put this right on the very end, and then I pushed it through, and you can use anything to push it through. And I'm thinking that it's better to do this when it's wet, otherwise when it's dry you could crack it. Got a little bit more give when it's wet. You can pull it tight until you get the knot in there, and then you're going to carry the knot down. Just kind of wiggle it down the string, see? Like that, but pull your handle out first, get it to where you want it, and then push the knot in the rest of the way. There we go. Now I can cut that end off. So what I would do next is get a little bit of tacky glue, and I'm going to pull those out, and I'll get some tacky glue on the other side of those knots, and then I'll pull that. Now that glue is dry, I can see that those handles are really stuck in there, and I could actually trim off a little bit of that bulk, but I'll just leave it for now. And speaking of the glue, this is now dry, and you can see, oh, where I put that glue down there, there's no film, but I can feel that it's stronger. Alright guys, I'm going to show you how I made the lids, but first I'm going to give you a couple of measurements here. So my basket with the twine handle is 1.5 inches by just a little bit better than 1 inch, and it's about 3/4 of an inch tall, and the top comes out to about 1.5 inches and 1.25 inches. The bassinet turned out to be a little bit better than 3/4 of an inch tall, and the top part 2 3/4 of an inch long by 1 3/4 inches across. Alright, so let's start making the lids. In the next clip, I'm just going to silently start the first couple of rows, and I am doing method 1 by wrapping the pine needles first. So let's get started. And it's almost fitting from side to side, but not lengthways. So I'm just going to squeeze this area here together on my table. I'm just going to rock it back and forth along the edge and pushing down. Look at the difference in shape already. And if you wanted a more circular shape, then you'd pull it apart with your fingers and try to push in these ends together. So you can help this shape along while it's wet. I don't want to add too many needles here. I don't want to make it too thick because it's almost fitting already, so I'm just going to keep a minimal amount in there, even though my gauge is going to be a little bit loose. Alright, now I'm not sure if I want it to fit just on the inside or if I want it to sit right on top. If I want it to fit on the inside, I can stop right now. Maybe we'll just keep it on the inside. On an angle, and sew those down. I'm just going to keep them on the edge and sew them. I'm going to set it inside, and now I can leave it dry, and once it's dry it'll hold that shape. While that dries, I'm going to work on this lid here, and I am going to sew the one side down, but once it's inside it's hard to get it open without sticking your fingernail in there and having to pry it open, so I need a little bit of a handle here to grab onto. Thought about beads, but I think I'll just keep it simple. I sewed together a couple of pine needles. Well, actually I bent over 2 pine needles over and over and over, and then I wrapped the middle of them with thread, and then I cut the ends. So I'm just going to whip stitch it to the top. Okay, that's sewn on there and it looks pretty cute. Now I'm thinking about hinging this here. I'm not sure if this is going to work, but I just wrapped thread here and I've left the thread tail. Now I'm going to do over here, I'm going to wrap that thread there on this side. I'm going to do a number of wraps here. And I'm ready to attach it to the basket. And just so you know, I did knot the starting thread tail and the working thread tail together and then started wrapping. Okay, so I'm just going to place it on the inside. I think what I'll do, so I decided on wrapping the thread around on top. Again, I had to push the front of the basket down so I could expose the top rim of the basket, and then I can get my needle back up and through the lid. And I'm going to do a number of those. Just around and around and around. Okay, so I'm going to keep wrapping. I'll turn the camera off and then we'll come back and see how it works. Alright, I am done wrapping, and I should have added that you don't want to wrap too tight, otherwise it'll make it too stiff to pick up. But that seems to have worked, guys. So thrilled about that. I was kind of wondering, how am I going to do that? And wrapping the thread works like a charm. Okay, now I'm going to finish off, go through one more time. And before pulling that all the way, I'll just knot it off. And knot it off again. And then I'll bring my needle through the threads. And I'll go down and underneath a couple of needles, bring it up. And then I can cut it free. If I was worried about it at all, I could just add a little bit of tacky glue on top of the thread and it'll stay in place. And if it's too tight, you can just wiggle it back and forth, loosen it up. And I should have added that these hinges here are about a ½ inch apart, and it's just where I figured would be the best contact between the lid and the basket. And I just found this in my stash. Look at that. Beautiful. It's going to make a beautiful liner for inside this basket. Now I'm not going to do this on camera because I'm no seamstress and I have no idea how to shape it properly to get it in there and then sew it in. I wish I knew how to do stuff like that, but what I found is when you don't know what to do, just start somewhere. So there's a natural fold here that gives me a really nice edge, nice clean edge. So I'm going to start there. I'm just going to place this on the very edge of the basket, and that's where I'll sew. I'll start sewing right about here. I'll sew across, and once I get over here, then I can decide what to cut away and what to sew down. Okay, so I'm going to do that off camera. And alright, I just inched my way along ever so slowly around the front here. And now I can so once I got to here, I finished off and then I started a new thread over here and I sewed this in. And now I got to do this part here, but it's got to be sewn lower, of course, because it can't go to the back. And I noticed when I was working that I pushed this in, and now I have a little space here, and the handle is just sliding. But I'm glad that happened before I finished filming, so I can show you what to do to fix that if that happens to you. And I doubled my thread, and I've knotted the other end. And this is now dry pine needle, so it's not the same as working with the wet ones. I bring my needle just underneath one of those rows that's starting to open there. There we go. And now I'm just going to go back and forth and create a bridge to stop this handle from sliding. I'm going to sew the pine needles above and below together. So there we go, that took care of that problem. So I'm just going to add a couple more threads here, and then I will figure out how I'm going to finish off the red fabric. I have a couple of ideas, and I'll let you know what I decide. And my handles are fixed, and now I'm going to finish up the fabric. So I have a raw edge there. I'm just going to see if I can turn it over and sew across to give me a clean edge. So I've got my thread, I've knotted to one end. Alright, so we got that straight edge on top, and I found once I got to the other end, once I just sewed through a couple of times and then brought my needle across behind the fabric and over here and then sewed this down, that holds it just fine. If I was to add any glue behind there, I'd have to be really careful because if you put too much glue, it'll show through your fabric. So you might want to do a test spot first. You would have to use the tiniest amount of glue. Because I was working around in there, my lid looks like it won't close now, but I just have to push down the back, get it back into position, and then when I close it, it should close. You could also add a little loop if yours is having problems closing. A little loop here you could just put over. Okay, and then my other little basket here with the string handles, I ended up just adding those pine needle little knobby thing at the top again. I thought that worked really well. So just bending over a couple needles and sewing around it, and then just whip stitching it to your lid. And I've decided to leave these as is because they're a good little stopper point for my lid. You can see this one here. I actually sewed in a little bundle of pine needles to keep my lid from falling through. Alright guys, we're almost done. I'm just going to show you how I dress the bassinet. Now I just tried out a little sample pillow here, and I just cut out 2 pieces of fabric and then sewed them together, like the basic back and forth stitches. So all basic skills there. And all I did to get this measurement was just place this on my fabric, and I went about, looks like about a ½ inch all the way around the base. And then I got some of this really soft fabric. It's kind of like a little bit of fur on there. So I'm going to place that on top of that, and I'm going to do a basic stitch from the bottom all the way around to the other side, and I'll leave a gap so I can turn it right side when I'm done. And because my fabric is fur, the linen fabric tends to walk across as you're sewing, so I'm gonna hold it. I should pin it actually, but yeah, I'm gonna stop right here. I'm just gonna knot off right here, trim up some of that. Oh, looks So sweet. Okay, I'm gonna stuff it with some of my polyester stuffing. Because this is fur, I can get away with just sewing across here, and that's what I'm gonna do. If you're not working with this kind of fabric, you'd have to kind of push this inside and do like a blanket stitch in there. Look at me giving sewing advice, my goodness. Anyway, guys, I'm sure you'll figure it out. See, those stitches get hidden inside that fur. So that's what I was talking about. See, this side isn't so neat looking, but because it's always going to be sitting this way, I'm not going to worry about it. I really love that. And here's my test run piece. That's what it will look like if you don't have fur. Still just as cute. And then this side here is what I was trying to explain was you have to turn this in and this in. And I don't know if it's called a blanket stitch or what it's called, but there's a special stitch that you can do that's invisible. Or you can just stitch it across, guys. It doesn't really matter. As long as it's sitting in here, you won't see that other end anyway. Check this out, guys. Last night before I went to bed, I tried one with color. And I used the absolute wrong thread to use. This is punch embroidery thread. It's acrylic and it broke many times. I had an issue with this thread, but I like the color and I don't have anything else on hand really. I could definitely improve on the stitching technique, but I'll get there. This is a journey, right? And we'll get there. So with all that said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope I gave you some ideas. I hope you get started making your own baskets. It's so much fun. Nature is amazing. And the fact that we use something that the tree got rid of, oh, it just makes my heart sing. And yeah, I hope to see your baskets. If you make any, post pictures on my Facebook page, Where the Gnomes Live, or tag me on Instagram, oyella_crafts, and I'll look forward to your photos. Until next time, guys, have a lot of fun, and we'll see you super soon.